Mappen Student Research Scholarship of $300 is being offered twice a year to both high school and college students. The scholarship is named for Marc Mappen, the former executive director of the New Jersey Historical Commission and a legend in the field of New Jersey studies. I'd like to thank the rest of the committee for their help with this: Gary Soretsky, Evelyn Kim Adams, and Ellen Mappen. I'm going to keep the introductions to our speakers very brief, as we have 4 or 5. The fifth wasn't sure if they could make it, but we'll get to that in a moment. So now we've got a lot of presentations. We'll first do the 2 from last March. So our first winners were Ashley Parker, a graduate student from Monmouth University, for her work analyzing heritage tourism in New Jersey, and Kamika Bennett, a graduate student at Rutgers University, for her thesis on multiracial labor organizing during the 1926 strike in Passaic and its lesser known complement in Lodi. So I did see Ms. Bennett there. Would you like to kick it off for us?
Hello, it's so nice to be around everyone.
Hi.
Thank you for having me. So I have a question. Is it possible for me to share screen or no?
Absolutely. Yep. Tara is running the Zoom and she will make you a co-host so that you can do that. Right, Tara?
You should be able to share now. So,
okay, perfect. I'm going to go ahead and see. Sorry, I'm just going to take a second to get set up here.
Take your time, Kamika.
and I will take a quick moment to just note to everyone that this part of the presentation is now going to be recorded.
Okay. All right. I think I'm all set up now. Okay. All right. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for having me again. My name is Kamika. I graduated in May 2020 from the American Studies program, master's program at Rutgers, Newark. My field of study is early 20th century labor and radical history. And my presentation today, called Lodi Workers Strike Back, is based on the Passaic strike of 1926. The strike includes the cities of Clifton, Garfield, Passaic, and Lodi in northern New Jersey. The Passaic strike of 1926 was composed primarily of white immigrant workers, mainly striking in the city of Passaic, New Jersey. The historical literature has mostly told this history. However, I have researched the history of the strike in Lodi, New Jersey. My research traces the multiracial organizing and unionism in the strike. Lodi's Black and white strikers were leading this multiracial organizing in the regional strike. It is from the angle of Lodi that the regional strike takes on a new meaning. It is at the periphery that we see some of the most exploited workers challenging factory conditions. We see multiracial organizing required for strike success, elevated all the way to the highest point in the overall strike. In my presentation, I demonstrate that the early anti-racist principles of the international communist movement bolstered the multiracial organizing in Lodi. So my presentation is broken down in the following segments. First, I discuss Garfield, Passaic, Lodi, and Clifton as being workers, as being organized in a regional strike. Again, the workers in Clifton, Garfield, Passaic, and Lodi organized themselves into a regional strike. Now, this is an intervention because in the history, although it is recognized as a regional strike, in practice, because there has been such limited history that speaks about Clifton, Garfield, and Lodi, my intervention is to actually in practice showcase that it was truly a regional strike across these city boundaries. My next segment will talk about the international events such as World War I, economic recessions, and the Bolshevik Revolution, as well as the different socialist and communist parties that were organizing in northern New Jersey at the time. The next segment will talk about the demands of the strikers and specifically the role of race or the color line as a strategic point to break the strike in Lodi. The last parts will talk about the loss of the strike, the role of the American Federation of Labor, replacing the communist strike leadership, and the way in which this strike was remembered. So what you're looking at right now is an image of the geographical landscape. So we have Clifton, Passaic, Garfield, and Lodi as, again, the cities that were a part of this regional strike. This is the river of Passaic as well as the Dundee Canal. And I should be able to use my pointer. Perfect. So here is the Dundee Canal. And then it pours into the Passaic River. So what you're looking at right now is, again, a map of the different areas of the city of Passaic, as well as if you look, I'm gonna go ahead and use my pointer again. If you go ahead and look at this area, this is where Lodi is located. So what we have here is there are many different factories in the strike region. However, I would like you to look at the first two factories, Botany and Frostman and Huffman, as well as United Peace Dye Works at the bottom. So what we see here is that in this strike region, it is dominated by woolen and worsted production, and the region is mostly centered in the city of Passaic. So one part of my research looks at the Negro question, which was a question that the International Communist Movement debated in the late 1910s, 1920s, early 1920s, because there were a lot of questions around the role of Black workers in the United States, and again, their role in an international movement for the working class. So some of the questions that were debated was Black people in the United States a nation? Were they a people? Was the Southern Black population its own region? What would happen to Blacks as they were migrating more and more to the north? So there was a lot of discussion that was considered the Negro question. And again, it was about whether or not the Black population in the United States should be considered a nation, a people. Should they have their own land? And was that necessary in order for there to be multiracial struggle? As mentioned before, workers in Russia revolted against the status quo, and the Bolshevik Revolution occurred in 1917. Now, this is very important because a lot of what was happening internationally was a lot of consciousness around class, around being a worker, and this being the preeminent identity for workers to be able to organize themselves as. So in Passaic, New Jersey, wage cuts were announced, and some of the conditions of these wage cuts was that there would be wage cuts were announced, and in response to these wage cuts, workers starting at Botany in the city of Passaic, 1,000 of them first went on strike. Workers in Garfield and Clifton and eventually Lodi also followed and also began to strike. Now, as a result of this, factory bosses went down south in order to find Black workers to bring them back to Lodi, New Jersey to be strike breakers. Now, there's been a long history of Black workers being used to break strike. And so this now took what was a regional strike conflict to a more national landscape. Now, the conditions that Black workers faced in Lodi was especially harsh. In general, many of the strikers, strike volunteers, and strike breakers recognized that the United Peace Dye Works, the dye house in Lodi, actually had some of the worst conditions, even in comparison to the working conditions in Passaic. So it becomes very interesting whether or not Italian workers in Lodi would actually organize with the Black strikebreakers that were brought in from the South. And in fact, they did. When I looked at the actual archival sources, at one point, some of the Black workers said, we did not need to be agitated because the conditions were so terrible at the dye house that we immediately walked out of the plant. So this is an image by Fred Ellis, a radical cartoonist affiliated with the communist movement, who again writes, it is the duty of the white workers to join with the Negro workers to batter down all restrictions which interfere with the admission of Black workers into unions. So this image was taken in January 1926 and again spread in the communist organ, the Daily Worker, which was the newspaper for, again, the Communist Party. Cyril Briggs, who was a Caribbeanist and a colonial subject of Britain, who eventually moves to Harlem, becomes, again, one of the journalists that begins to report about the Passaic strike. So even though the history does not reflect Cyril Briggs as being one of the reporters, he was indeed very essential to reporting all of the different coalitions that were helping the year-long strike. And again, someone very important to the continuation and the maintenance of multiracial unionism. This is a picture of Sam Elam. He was a very important strike leader in Lodi alongside Maggie Pitoko. And again, as I said before, this was a regional strike. But one of the most important things to take away from this strike is that at the periphery of the strike, where historians have not, again, actually explored, lays the multiracial organizing and unionism that actually heighten the worker solidarity in the strike. Thank you.
Well, that was just perfectly timed and very, very interesting, Kamika. Thank you so much. In the interest of time, I think we could maybe take just one or two questions for Kamika before we move on. And then, at the end, when all the students have gone, if there's any extra time, we'll take some more questions if you have them. So anybody want to pose a question? You can go ahead and unmute yourself.
I'd like to ask Kamika how she became interested in this subject.
That's a really great question. Thank you. I'm a Jamaican immigrant, so I came here at 8 years old, and my family lived for 10 years in Passaic, New Jersey. So as I became a master's student in 2017, time flies, in 2017 at Rutgers, Newark, I began to explore the labor history of Northern New Jersey, and I stumbled across archival sources at NYU that allowed me to realize that there was, in fact, amazing things that occurred in the city that I grew up in, which, of course, as local history, I never got the opportunity to actually learn about. So that was my personal connection to the strike. And I immediately jumped on, again, going through more and more of the archival sources and finding that the Textile Strike Bulletin, the newspaper of the workers, actually had a lot of workers, Black and white, writing in, speaking about the color line being a strike breaking tactic, and actually specifically in practice, as well as in theory, pushing back against racism in their union or in their unionism.
Thank you, Kamika. Do we have one more question before we move on to our next?
Did you find out anything about what happened to the Black workers after the strike was lost?
That's a great question. So when I look at the US Census between 1920 and 1930, pause. The city of Passaic is where imperialism in the United States really began to develop, because many of the German capitalists came over to Passaic and to this region because of a tariff barrier. They wanted to actually breach the tariff barrier, and so this is why they came to this region. So as a result of that, a lot of what happened after the strike was many of the strike breakers, perhaps they went back home. But when I look at the census, in 1920, there was about 30 Black residents in Lodi. However, by 1930, there's 133. Now, there's a contradiction because the newspapers of the strikers indicate that there was around 400 Black strikers in the strike. So there's a lot of contradictions around what exactly happened. And this is still something that I'm very interested in tracing.
Well, thank you so much, Kamika. That was wonderful. It's kind of hard to applaud, as everyone deserves to be applauded when we're virtual, but that was a wonderful presentation, and I'm so proud that we could help fund your work. So sit tight, because you get to listen to the other wonderful presentations now if you have time, and then
yes,
at the end, if we have time, we'll see if there are any other questions for you. So thank you, Kamika. Our second winner in that first round back in March was Ashley Parker, who, as I noted, was a graduate student at Monmouth University at the time, and her work looked at heritage tourism in New Jersey. So Ashley, I see you're on, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you. Can everyone see it all right?
Yep, looks great.
Perfect. Okay. So I want to begin by saying hello and thank you for your generous contribution towards my graduate thesis project titled Humanizing Visitor Data, Seeking Connection Through Nostalgia, Childhood, Family, and Education. So I want to begin by explaining why I chose this topic. So I selected the topic of heritage tourism and tourist motivations because of my work with the New Jersey Historic Trust and Journey Through Jersey. I have been working on Journey Through Jersey since 2018, and it's the state's go-to website for all things heritage tourism in New Jersey. It was created in 2017 by the New Jersey Historic Trust, which is a historic preservation and heritage tourism grant funding agency, which I have also been fortunate enough to work with since 2019. So during my time there, I've learned that there's a disparity between the New Jersey Travel and Tourism Division and heritage tourism. And until very recently, the state has not recognized the Arts and Cultural Institution of the state as sought after tourism destinations. And the trust and the Board of Trustees have been advocating for nearly 10 years the importance of heritage tourism to the state of New Jersey. So due to this disparity and my growing interest in applied anthropology and my marketing and advertising experience for the trust, I wanted to get to know the people behind the visitation data that we continuously ask for in our grant applications. So the purpose of this research study was not just to identify the interests, desires, and motivations of heritage tourists, but also demonstrate how these characteristics influence heritage tourists' reasons for travel. By focusing on the individual and what sets them apart from the collective whole, I learned that each person has their own intimate relationship with history that influences their motivational and travel decision-making processes. And my research is designed to be used as a foundational tool for cultural and history organizations to use in order to help guide marketing, advertising, and programming decisions to help promote the continued awareness of our history. So due to the ongoing pandemic, I've had to adapt my research in response to lockdowns and CDC recommendations. So originally I designed my research to include in-depth one-on-one interviews to get more detailed responses. but in response to COVID-19 and public feedback, I adapted the interview as a survey. At the time, Zoom and similar platforms were too new and required more work from the participants, such as downloading, creating accounts, learning the ins and outs of the features and device capabilities. So then I also included a pile sort that was slightly adjusted and adapted to be used on an online platform.
It's a pile sort.
A pile sort gives people, for example, in my research, I had interests, activities, and historic sites and museums. And people are able to take cards with these items on them and put them in categories that make most sense to them. So for example, you might see the battleship New Jersey with military history. And then from there, you would ask people to explain why they created those categories with using those cards. And then I also conducted phone interviews with history practitioners in order to gauge their needs and how they currently use visitor data. My sample is people with an interest in history and heritage tourism. So I used criterion sampling to recruit participants, and participants had to follow the New Jersey Historic Trust and/or Journey Through Jersey on Facebook or Instagram. 40 people completed the survey, which included a number of multiple choice questions, as well as some open-ended questions to allow people to provide the types of programming they are interested in, general interests, and how they plan for a trip. So these questions helped me understand how they typically plan for a vacation and what was important to these visitors. Among the 40 respondents, 31 were from New Jersey, and 9 were from out of state, representing California, Florida, Illinois, Mississippi, New York, and Pennsylvania. So following the survey, participants were directed to complete the pile sort. Of the 40 respondents, only 15 completed the pile sort, which provided information about people's likes, dislikes, and what they thought had interconnecting histories. So respondents created groups based on amenities and things to do, historical themes, interests, entertainment, and special events. I sent emails to 77 organizations, and only 5 agreed to participate in my research with the phone interviews. This was saddening, but I also expected it because it has been the case even at work while trying to contact organizations for site visits and to congratulate them for being awarded a grant. So I found that history practitioners primarily use visitor data for grant writing purposes and annual appeals. Most store visitor data in spreadsheets. The history organizations also shared how they have adapted to COVID-19 by focusing on their historic narrative and utilizing social media to generate content. They also expressed interest in learning from other organizations to see how they have coped with the pandemic. The following are verbatim responses that express each of my principal outcomes. So for the purpose of my research, nostalgia is defined as the yearning for aspects of one's past. So for example, to events, persons, or sites. Taking the children is one of the leading motivations for people who visit historic sites and museums, because it is used as a cultural tool to socialize and acculturate children as a familiar resource for defining the meaning of childhood and as a means for parents to instill values in their children. In addition, a subfield of the heritage tourism industry has emerged called legacy tourism, which people travel to engage in genealogical endeavors, to search for information, or to simply feel connected to ancestors and ancestral roots. Similarly, some people will take family root trips to visit sites where their family experienced atrocities. And this is also a subfield of dark tourism. An abundance of responses noted education as a motivator and as the reason for being interested in history. So published in 2014, museums spend more than $2 billion a year on education, receive more than 55 million school children, and spend more than 18 million instructional hours dedicated to educational programming. So in addition, as civics and history are taught less and less in schools, museums are becoming the most trustworthy sources of information while inspiring curiosity in history and fostering valuable learning opportunities, which can be fitted to individualized experiences. So my recommendations for history organizations is to embrace social media. It is one of historic sites can you utilize for things like publicity, social media, and event promotion. It was also one of the recommendations provided by respondents in the survey. And social media is free or requires little or no cost and engages with the public and conveys important information. So during my phone interviews, organizations stress the importance of communicating with visitors to learn more about them and what brought them to their site. And also I encourage them to develop personas. So personas are a great way to humanize data by remembering details about individual people. And they are profiles that can encompass all or one of these interests or their character defining features. So in addition, they are also a useful tool for humanizing data and helping to create valuable target audience profiles that are also fun to create as a team and can be effective no matter the size or the budget of the organization. So the goal of my thesis was to understand the interests, desires, and motivations of heritage tourists in New Jersey in order to help local history organizations create sustainable programming, marketing, and advertising opportunities, and promote continued awareness of our history. And in doing so, I learned that each person has their own intimate relationship with history that influences their motivational and travel decision-making processes. So based on a qualitative and quantitative analysis of heritage tourist motivations, it can be inferred that heritage tourists visit historic sites and museums based on three main factors, which was nostalgia, childhood and family, and education. And these principal outcomes indicate the potential for historic sites and museums to use these emotional and motivational identifiers to attract visitors and increase interest at historic resources. So these findings are based on people that already have an interest in history and frequently visit historic museums. So I would encourage future research to look for people who did not meet this criteria. And this population was not my primary sample due to its size. But by building on this data collected from this study about interests, desires, and motivations, heritage and of heritage tourists, future research can provide historic sites museums with tools necessary to reach a new audience. And this would also help to better understand the implications of these results. Future studies could address the specific memories and events that impacted people's responses regarding their motivations for seeking nostalgia, family, childhood, and education in more detail. And this is an important point for historic sites and museums to consider when creating new educational programming. So by identifying these triggers, historic sites and museums will be equipped to combat these negative experiences by giving people the opportunity to create positive learning experience to help build interest. So heritage tourists seek connections through nostalgia, childhood and family, and education. And they each have their own unique experiences that motivated them to visit a historic site or museum. And it is important to remember that despite collecting demographics and keeping track of the number of visitors to your site, heritage tourists are complex with unique experiences. And I argue that by focusing on and recognizing these intimate details about heritage tourists, history organizations can increase visitation, create deeper and lasting expressions with their visitors, and continue to promote our history for future generations. So at this time, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Great, thank you so much, Ashley. This was another well-timed and thoughtful presentation, and I commend you for pivoting as COVID unfolded in the midst of your research, which really involved participation, as everyone was kind of sheltering in place. So with that, we could take one or two questions before we move on. Looks like Maxine is perhaps unmuting. No? Okay. Anyone, please feel free to unmute
Yeah.
yourself. Okay, go ahead, Bob.
Melissa? Ashley, thank you very much for that presentation. I'd like to hear more about this concept of dark tourism.
Sure. So dark tourism is most commonly referred to with like the Holocaust, for instance. People would go and visit places like Auschwitz to see these places where their family experienced atrocities. And it's kind of like a building tool that families use to make deeper connections amongst each other.
I have some material from a precise example of that. My father was friends with a Holocaust refugee. They would write back and forth, and so I inherited some correspondence that he received from this man, including some letters and postcards written in the middle 1960s when he went back to the village in Austria that he had to flee from to escape the Nazis. And I'm, I don't think I should throw this stuff out. I think I should deposit it somewhere, but where it should go and how much of this kind of material there is, I don't know.
Absolutely. I would definitely hold on to it. That's certainly an interesting point of view that we don't typically get to see.
And the letters gave some indication of how warmly he was received on his return, which sort of shocked me.
Mm-hmm.
Bob, I wonder if Change at Brookdale would be interested in those, or the Holocaust Museum in DC, if you're looking to find them a good home.
I thought of the Holocaust Museum in DC. I also made a stab at trying to find the next of kin of this man with no success so far. He was a PhD chemist who was displaced entirely around the world. He made his way through several European countries with the Nazis on his heels. Finally got from Norway to Britain. The British sent him to New Zealand for the duration of the war. And then he continued in that path around the world, came to the West Coast. He was a PhD chemist already in Germany, earned a second PhD at UCLA after the war. And my father, who was a chemist, knew him through that connection. Yeah, I'd like to, make some decision about what to do with the material.
Bob, there's also a Holocaust Center at Drew University.
Mm-hmm.
So you could contact them too.
I think I will make a note of that. Thank you.
Okay, do we have one more question for Ashley before we move on?
Quick question for Ashley. Thank you for the presentation. You got relatively low response from institutions themselves, but did you find places that you felt were doing sort of what you saw as the best practices? Are there historical sites in New Jersey, and could you perhaps give an example of a program or an effort that you feel is on the right track?
Absolutely. That's a great question. For continuity's sake, I can't give a specific resource that did reach out regarding my research. However, they were excellent in regards to adapting to COVID. They started to really use this time to develop their narrative and try to identify underrepresented histories that they may not have been thought about previously. They also created outdoor educational spaces in response to the schools needing outdoor spaces to bring the kids back. They also make it apparent to go around and speak to their visitors, whether they're just looking for brochures at a kiosk, or if they're really interested in an artifact on their site, they just go and they spark conversation. So I think that's an excellent example of sites that are really going a little step further.
Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Ashley. I will give you another round of applause.
Thank you.
And we will move on to our October 2020 winners. We had 3. The first presenter will be Eric Deutsch. He's a PhD candidate at the State University of New York at Buffalo. And we funded some of his research on the Seeing Eye in Morristown, New Jersey. He was specifically looking at the racial and gender demographics of the institution. So Eric, floor is all yours.
Thanks. I'm gonna share the screen real quick, and feel free to yell at me at any point if things are not to your liking, or if you can't see something, or if there's too much Bruce Springsteen pandering. This is a picture on the right when I visited Morristown in September. We'll get there quickly, or I'll pretty much go through this. But I, like Ashley, had to pivot significantly doing research in 2020. I think everybody here, except maybe, who's it, Ron, is in Florida. I think everybody else has had to pivot significantly in their lifestyle and how they're approaching things, considering where everything lies now. So we're going to go through, I really am looking at the guide dog movement in the late 1920s through the 30s. That starts with the Seeing Eye, which is if you're from New Jersey, if you're a historian in New Jersey, you should be at least very familiar with the name, but we'll get briefly to its history without bogging down in the history. So I'm going to go through this slide very quickly. But in 1927, Dorothy Harrison Eustace, who is from I think Eastern Pennsylvania. She is living with her husband and a German Shepherd trainer / breeder in Switzerland. They have a nice chalet. She is offered to write about her work by an editor at the Saturday Evening Post. She ends up writing about what she saw a few years before in Germany, which was guide dogs leading blind veterans of World War I. And she does this because she doesn't want an onslaught of American breeders asking for German Shepherds that she's training. So she thinks this is going to actually be a way that she can kind of push away and dissuade people from checking in on her. Of course, this has the opposite effect. And Morris Frank, who is a blind person, 18 or 19 years old, going to Vanderbilt, lives in Nashville, who'd been fully blind at that point for many years, hears, there's a lot of lore, but he hears that this article is in the Saturday Evening Post, brings it home. His mother is also blind, but it's unrelated. His father, the story goes, reads this long article about German Shepherds kind of bringing life, and what they use a lot is freedom is the word that's used, freeing a lot of blind people and permitting blind men, especially in Germany, to re-engage with civic society. So Morris Frank, we were all teenagers at some point. He had the balls to correspond with Dorothy Harrison Eustace and said, how do I get my own guide dog? And Dorothy Harrison Eustace has the money to say, well, why don't you get aboard and come visit us in Switzerland, and we'll train you. So it is just the right amount of chutzpah and motivation and money to set the balls in motion. And so Buddy is the first dog. He's the dog that's on the right side. It's me, Morris Frank, and Buddy. So the Seeing Eye incorporated in Nashville in 29. They eventually move in 32. I have some postcards. Again, when you can't research things, you have to go on eBay and buy postcards for 70 cents. But this is the old grounds. I'm not sure if the headquarters still looks like this, but it was on Whippany Road. Although they use things, I think I write, they moved for a few reasons, including climate is central. But there's Lake Opanaka is what they call it, but I think it's Opanaki, and it's a few miles. I forget if it's north or south of Morristown, but it's neither here nor there. So the archives, I'm looking at this is from my doctoral dissertation. As was noted, I'm at the University at Buffalo doing my doctorate in history. So I had two options, which were to go to the Seeing Eye or an alternative showed up. So as COVID is happening, and then not to jump the gun, but I'm relying on a lot of digitized material that I'm finding from the 1920s and 1930s that are not everywhere, but with a little bit of elbow grease, if that's the right phrase, you can track down a lot of archival material from the 1920s and 30s, especially about something that was considered very novel and did have appeal to a huge American audience. So the Seeing Eye does have public archives. Once I saw that there was a lot of connection between who was getting the services and who was being offered these services and connecting that to citizenship, gender, and race centrally. Requests to visit the archives, which I was being aided along the way until requests, I had questions that came up, and we'll get to them later, that could not be answered fairly, and I couldn't even guess at the answer without looking at material, which they have. And I was, told, this is probably 6 months ago, that an attorney for the Seeing Eye, which is a well-funded institution, would get back to me to discuss their visit. I'm an attorney. I know what that, when you don't hear from an attorney after 6 months, it's usually a code for we're not going to help. So the alternative, Morristown and the Morris Township Library has a collection of the Seeing Eye documents on microfilm from its origins through the 30s. One problem, I love this. I'm really doing my PowerPoint, getting my PowerPoint muscles toned. So the library reopens in early September. This happens very quickly. I am very aware that they are planning on opening. I've contacted a lot of libraries this summer. There are a lot of libraries and institutions that are closed to the public, but do have archival staff. I'm sure a lot of you can appreciate this, who are working there. Will show up once a week, every 2 weeks. We'll scan documents, we'll sort things, we'll do the administrative jobs. But again, they're not permitting the public to enter. In September, New Jersey at this point has done, I'm from Buffalo, both New Jersey and Western New York have done a phenomenal job up until then of really getting a hold on this virus. But I am not sure, I don't think anybody was sure how long this open window would last. So the library reopens in early September. I jet it down to Morristown, where I do have connection, like a friend's mother still lives there. So it was a very fun few days with my friend, who, since this is a recorded, shall remain nameless. But the collection I used was the North Jersey History and Genealogy Center, which I do recommend to people if you are near Morristown or are interested. If you do have generations of family in New Jersey, they had an incredible collection there, and the staff couldn't have been more gracious or helpful. So we're gonna, I guess, pivot a little bit. And so in the Seeing Eyes material and material concerning the Seeing Eye, there's a lot about the deserving blind, who are the ones who are being pretty much marketed the Seeing Eye services. And since the guide dog is pretty much in the service of permitting blind people and to re-enter society on seeing people's terms, that is generally, that's not code for. That means that we want blind people to be able to work again. So the most qualified people for guide dogs are men and white men. And the answers to that race question are still up in the air, but the gender question is very much answered and answerable. So you could probably understand why more men than women are blind and are working in general, but they're also acquiring. You could see the little thing on the right. So 80% of injuries to eyes, so people who obtain blindness, and since the Seeing Eye does, I think, still prioritize people who are quote unquote newly blind. If you do get hurt on the job and are blinded on the job, you're more likely to be a man. So when 75% of the graduates of the Seeing Eye by 44 are men, it's understandable. But it plays into this idea of who is a citizen, what civic responsibility means, yada yada yada. So again, the Seeing Eye, this is a lot of historiographical inside baseball stuff that is probably, I'd be happy to share this with everybody afterwards, and this is recorded, so you can pause the video here, but I and nothing if not a sucker for sticking to a good time limit. So the question that ultimately is going to be unanswerable is, was the guide dog movement in its first decade plus a success? So on the pro side, it raised a lot of awareness and I said, I write, I'm so embarrassed. I said, awareness and money toward a singular cause for blind Americans. And remember, this is during the Great Depression. So raising money is not something that needs to be overseen. This is a phenomenally, something that should be celebrated. And you can see on the right side of the slide, the kind of exponential growth in the first few years. But keep track of that number as well. So the blue, by the way, I didn't write, the blue is the high estimate, and the orange, or the kind of burnt orange, is the lower end of the estimate. So you can imagine that somewhere in the middle would be the truth, as it usually is. So here's the other side, the flip side, is that per a report from the Seeing Eye, so this is from the archives, 550 guide dogs were being used in the US in 1941. Per federal reports, 230,000 blind people are living in the United States in 1940, so a year before. So I do the math for you, and I have that slide. I promise there's a little thing of blue at the very bottom. So 99.9976% of blind people are not aided by guide dogs, where a lot of private money that, again, there's a very limited pool of private money during the Great Depression is going to, and it's also shaping people's understandings of what charity and deservingness and disability and rehabilitation mean. And again, do I write? I mean, it's just open-ended questions, and I'll be happy to answer them if you raise them, or at least put as many caveats as possible to my answer. So race, by the end of the 30s, hundreds of blind Americans were trained with guide dogs in the archives, the Seeing Eye archives. 2, you're not seeing, this is not a test. 2, Black people, they're both men. So the possibilities arise, and this is what kind of prompts these conversations where I need to see applications. Is the Seeing Eye barring people on the basis of race? They don't have a policy against race, obviously. They permit Black people to apply, they permit Black people to enter the facility in the 1930s, but is it a neutral policy with what we call in the Title VII world, a disparate impact? So even though you say we're open to all, if you're only marketing to a certain group, you're obviously not open to all. And the second question remains, or the third, I guess the third is the most interesting. So were Black people themselves not applying to the Seeing Eye, or were Black people applying to the Seeing Eye and not being admitted? Were they being admitted but not accepting admission because it wasn't free to come from a town? And Black people on a whole are per capita significantly more likely to be blind than white people. This is based on plenty of census data in the 1930s. But there are questions that were raised and deserve being addressed that cannot be addressed at this time, and we're not going to blame COVID entirely on that, but it's certainly not helping. And certainly you're screaming at your computer right now. But Eric, did you find a material when you drove down to Morristown regarding the Seeing Eye, relating the institution and its actors to fascism and anti-Semitism? And you'll be so happy to hear, yes, of course I did. So Dorothy Harrison Eustace, who was the money behind the operation, and wrote, not only did she write for the Saturday Evening Post the article on, called The Seeing Eye, but she also wrote an article championing the idea of having dogs replace horses in urban cities for police forces to pretty much attack communists demonstrating their political beliefs, pursuant to the First Amendment right to do so. She also trained dogs for Mussolini in 1929 in Rome. So that's another thing that happened. And this is so there's a lot of material on the Seeing Eye. This is not the first dissertation that's mentioned the Seeing Eye. But you'll say, then why the hell hasn't there been any material on the Seeing Eye? And this interesting document. Well, I guess you'll have to read the dissertation to find out. But there's competition in the guide dog movement, and there's a Jewish man in Minnesota who actually trained the first guide dog in the United States, which was used by a senator from Minnesota in the 1920s, who actually died subsequent to his guide dog passing away. He used his secretary as an aide and was struck by a car, which again raised a lot of interesting questions. Was kind of a marketing tool for the guide dog movement, that guide dogs are safer than human aides. So these are the last things we're wrapping up. So the Mappen scholarship has been critically important. I think Ashley really put it well, and I kind of want to go off this, like, researching in this year has been a real test of whether I want to be a historian. I mean, it's a test of how well I can use the internet, and how many emails and how many cold calls I'm willing to make without knowing that I'll ever hear a response. And the Mappen scholarship and the support of the NJSAA has been really motivating and central to getting me down to Morristown in the first place. And I think the crux is, and the final thing is, I left with information when I left Morristown. That is, I mean, there's 500 pages at this point. There will be a dissertation defense this year. But I left with more questions than I imagined. I think a lot of us have been in that place. And so that'll be book number 2. But book number 1 is going to be thanks in large part to the legacy of Dr. Mappen and you guys. So thank you so much. I don't have a thank you slide. I apologize for my oversight. But
Okay, well, thank you so much, Eric. It's disheartening, but perhaps not surprising to see that racism and anti-Semitism pervaded the guide dog, or it appears that it pervaded the guide dog movement, as it has so many areas of life. Do we have just a question or two for Eric before we move on to our next presenter? Paul, go ahead.
Yeah, so very interesting topic in general. So I'm curious as to what extent you're trying, in the context of your dissertation, or possibly your next project, to deal with the experiences of people who ended up with these guide dogs.
Paul, it's a great question. And I'm half using that to vamp, but also there is a lot of material that is written by people with guide dogs. Morris Frank is the first, and he does have a guide dog, and then his words also count a lot. There are a few people who are central actors in my project whose voices I am really happy to have center stage. There's a woman from should I forget the small town in upstate New York, who goes, and I mean, people make careers out of this in the 1930s by bringing their dog. She goes to Europe. She's actually the first woman to speak at it's not the Lions Club, it is the Rotary Club. She speaks at the International Rotary Club Convention in the 1930s, and they sent her to France. They also don't allow her dog to go into Britain because of quarantine for rabies in the 1930s. So there's a lot of material surrounding her. But there's very few and far between are sources from the users themselves that aren't very clearly. I'm using a lot of publicly available stuff like newspapers, and fewer, as opposed to memoirs, and people finding their grandfather's notes after they pass. So there's another big question of agency, and also whether you're answering to fit a certain narrative that the reporter wants to tell about the institution. And then since these people are also, they're literally being paid to market the guide dog, and the guide dog's opened up a ton of doors for them. Championing, like using their voice and using voices of disabled people is critically important in my work, but it's also raising its own questions that can themselves be problematic to even air, because then then you have to address it. But thanks for your question, Paul.
Okay, we can get just one more in for Eric, if anyone would like to unmute themselves. Okay, we'll let everybody just stew on that a little bit, and maybe we'll get another question at the end, but this is perfect because we can keep things chugging right along. Thank you again, Eric. And I think this is actually going to be our last presentation. I don't see Shu Wan on, and he let me know this morning that he had a bit of an issue. So our last, but certainly not least presentation will be Bill Elwell from Monmouth University, who is going to talk to us a bit about his work into the intersection of the railroads and tourism, specifically at the Jersey Shore. So take it away, Bill.
Hi, everybody. Just wanted to echo Eric and Ashley and thank you all for allowing or funding my work and allowing me to continue. This project is the culmination of not only my master's thesis, but also a senior thesis for my bachelor's. So it's a long time coming. Let me share my screen real fast. Can everybody see that? I think we can.
Yep, we can see.
Okay, great. So my project is entitled Steel Rails to the Seashore, Railroads, Tourism, and the why can't I open this? I'm sorry, everybody. Let's go. I am not using my own computer, and this is kind of confusing me a bit.
Take your time.
Here we go.
There you go.
Sorry about that. Steel Rails to the Seashore, Railroads, Tourism, and Commuters at the Jersey Shore. For New Jersey Studies, I submitted just the tourism section. It was pretty long, and if we have time, I'm happy to discuss more of it, but the tourism part is the most important. So my idea in this project was to take an interdisciplinary approach and to try and look at railroad history from a local history combined with a microhistory source of methodology. Most railroad histories that exist on the scholarly level seem to be macro history, where they're looking at American railroads as the larger theme here and how certain things change them throughout times and how railroads change the country. I look at one area in specifically from Cape May up to Sandy Hook and the Raritan Bay Shore, broadly called the Jersey Shore, to see how the railroads affected it using local history ideas of chronology and summary, in addition to making contextualizations and analysis. So one of the biggest problems with this is source material. And there are plenty of sources out there. Most of them are local histories, like some of these pictured. Some of you might have come across them before, where they are literally just chronologies of individual railroads or individual locations. And these are great books. They are chock full of facts, but there is no analysis and there's no reading between the lines or between the tracks, as it were. So I wanted to take all this and make a shorter chronology that could be used as a way to analyze certain aspects of railroads at the Jersey Shore. So the sources that I then added to it were a lot of timetables and railroad advertisements, and I'm using showing a bit of them here. Mostly timetables. They are either public timetables, which are the ones that you'd pick up at a station, or employee timetables like this one here, which are issued to conductors and engineers and station masters, telegraphers, you name it. They each give different information to who's supposed to be reading. The public timetables were very interesting, especially for the tourism section, because they are up until World War II, full, even on the national level, full of Jersey Shore specific advertisements with photographs and graphic design and pictures and even just text. As the Depression goes on and forth, these start to wane down a little bit. And then by World War II, they're gone completely and never came back. Again, then advertisements published by the railroads, there's different types. There's these which are tackboard flyers for this pegboards at stations, and then brochures and guidebooks. And this specific one right here, I'd like to come back to at the end. Guidebooks published for potential travelers to take with them that give information about hotels, and like the modern Forbes or travel book that you'd find at Barnes and Noble or something like that. I used a lot of newspapers and magazine sources as well as maps on timetables and government sources, public law, ICC financial documents, which were submitted by the railroads about abandonments and such like that, as well as secondary sources, both academic and the local histories that I used. I would like to note that, as Eric and Ashley said, COVID has made proper research really, really difficult. But for this project, it actually wasn't that difficult. There aren't that many archives with the type of railroad sources that I'm looking for. There's the Rutgers Archive. There is, in Wilmington, Delaware, the Hagley Museum, which contains the entire Pennsylvania Railroad archives. But most of these are just corporate documents and maps instead of these timetables and advertisements that I'm looking for, which are more of the vernacular that the people would have been using as opposed to the railroad brass. These sources are mostly found in private collections, which is why the grant was extremely helpful to me, because I had to go on eBay or call people or use Facebook, which was a really, really helpful thing in Facebook swap meet groups, as well as train shows and such like that. I have to use these sources to buy my own material. I mentioned it before, the one guidebook, which I have in my hand now, was a very expensive one, and the grant was very helpful for that. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you for that. This section here, I'm not going to stay on, was part of my local history section in creating a complete chronology of Jersey Shore railroads, when they reached where they were going, why they reached where they were going, what they did then, and then when they ultimately got ripped up, or if they're still there, like New Jersey Transit's North Jersey coastline and the Atlantic City line. So I won't get into that very hard. Tourism is the most important part, I think, of this paper in discussing tourism as the railroad's contribution to New Jersey history. The first tourists in the entire country were upper class. They usually went to the area anywhere, but specifically the Jersey Shore for health retreats. The salt air was apparently really helpful for health. But as industrialization swept through the 1850s in North Jersey and around the Philadelphia and Trenton corridor, you start gaining a new middle class in groups of skilled and unskilled labor. The skilled labor usually were the ones that got disposable incomes first. And as the unskilled labor climbed up the social ladder, they also gained disposable incomes, which they used to mimic the upper class people that employed them and decided to come down for health resorts. The first resorts were Cape May and Long Branch, established before the 1850s, but established as resorts by then. And this new middle class was looking for new places to visit. The railroads stepped in. Their first targets were connecting Long Branch and Cape May to a national network. And as they spread along the coast, specifically for creating these new resorts, they established new towns, created new identities, and created new ways of doing business with and against each other. So one thing that they did to entice more passengers was create the excursion rate, which nationally led to the idea of a day tripper, which this area specifically was able to make it happen because the metropolitan areas where these tourists were being sourced from were within an hour or two's train ride from the beach. So a potential middle-class tourist who didn't want to spend that much money could go on a weekend or a day vacation and then make it back in time to get to your next shift. This created the idea of Benny's versus Shoobies as well, which are monikers that you hear every day if you come to the Jersey Shore. Benny's, a railroad acronym specifically. There's a lot of conjecture on how that one came to be, but Benny's, as an acronym, BENNY, refers to Bayonne, Elizabeth, Newark, New York, and came from luggage tags along the Central Railroad of New Jersey and the Pennsylvania Railroad feeding into the New York and Long Branch Railroad from South Amboy to Bayhead. The other thing was they created guidebooks and pamphlets. Like I said, both of the major railroads did them. I have one here. I actually have another one in the mail right now. Hotels and real estate, they got into the real estate and the hotel market. This was specific. Oh, I skipped Shoobies. I'm sorry. I'll come back to that. Hotels and real estate, especially Atlantic City, where the Camden and Atlantic Railroad formed a subsidiary company, the Camden and Atlantic Real Estate Company, to buy property, build hotels, build restaurants, and then use their own railroad to funnel tourists to them. Now, that kind of fought back with this middle class thing and created the idea of a shoobie, which refers to Pennsylvania and West Jersey and Delaware tourists coming to the southern Jersey Shore. You've probably seen it spelled SHOOBIES, but the original term is quite literally shoe, because middle class tourists with their brand new disposable incomes circumvented the Camden and Atlantic and the railroad-owned restaurants and hotels by bringing their lunches in shoe boxes, so they didn't have to pay for an expensive railroad meal. One other way that they competed and brought fame to the Jersey Shore was in creating name and express trains to try and convince passengers to get to these places faster and in luxury. The most famous being the Blue Comet, but also the Nellie Bly, which was the Pennsylvania's answer to the CNJ's Blue Comet, and including advertisements in paper products, in newspapers. I have newspapers going all the way up into North Jersey and Western Pennsylvania that are enticing people to come to the Jersey Shore, as well as national system timetables and brochures, which were put, this brochure is stamped having been put in the St. Louis Union Station. So the decline of tourism with the Jersey Shore coincides with the rise of the automobile and the rise of state highways beginning in the 1920s. On a really sad note, the Tuckerton Railroad, which ran from Whitings, and I use the S purposely, to Tuckerton, was killed. The highest revenue it ever ran was carrying construction material for Highway 9, and then it died within 2 years. As cars start to take over and people have disposable incomes, not only for a vacation, but also for a car, and new state highways and then the Parkway and the Turnpike allow people to drive to their destination, the railroads reoriented and instead put all their marbles into serving commuters, which for the most part, they still do along the North Jersey Shore and to a much lesser extent to Atlantic City. So I won't go into this very much right now, but I would like to note that according to this, the Jersey Shore railroads were the most important part to developing a tourism business at the Jersey Shore and then reorienting into commuters. This was mostly due to the lack of any other heavy industry in the area, but also due to just every half mile creating another station for tourists to come. And also I'd like to note that in doing this, in combining the chronology with the analysis part, you're able to get a more accurate and in-depth look at railroad history that these larger scale histories don't usually get into the nitty-gritty of. So thank you again very much. It's been a pleasure, and I am continuing with this project, hopefully into a doctoral dissertation, but I have more sections of this to go on in the future.
All right, awesome. Round of applause for you, Bill. Congratulations on a great presentation. We do have time for a question or two for Bill. So would anyone like to take the first one? Go ahead, Paul.
There we go. So as you've been doing this, your focus in your discussion was mostly on the railroads. To what extent are you dealing with the communities and how they were influenced, impacted, and so forth by the railroad systems?
I do actually have an entire section that I purposely left out of my master's thesis on the building of not only the physical communities, but the social communities as well. Thankfully, the Asbury Park Press was extremely heavy on railroad reporting, but also all the other Jersey Shore papers had that in there for a while. But as the railroad moves a mile or so down, you have different communities that are asking for the railroad to come further, or then you have the railroads carrying certain parts for the community built. The first 50 years were all, or first 80 years were all coal, and then that switches to fuel oil and such like that. I'm from Point Pleasant, and I will use the Point Pleasant example most importantly, where Captain John Arnold was the biggest landowner of the area, and the railroad was the New York and Long Branch Railroad stopped in Manasquan, would not bridge the Manasquan River because the inlet was too wild and closed up at random times. But Captain John Arnold donated not only the land for a right-of-way, but also for station and yard complex, which totaled ended up being like 2.5 square miles free of charge to the railroad for them to bridge. And that's what allowed, from that point, allowed Point Pleasant Beach to develop into a boardwalk and a destination instead of just one little hotel on the Manasquan River.
Melissa, you're muted.
I made it the whole meeting without having to be told that. I was just thanking everyone again, saying how rewarding it is to see all of your work and how much I look forward to continuing to follow the great things that you do. Are there any last questions before we call it a night?
I'll just make a comment. I chair the Graduate Student Award Committee of this organization, and I think all of you have projects that I will be in touch with you about perhaps going for the award. So.
Awesome, great idea. Any other closing comments or questions? I see a hand raised, Jessica. Got to unmute. I did the same thing, so don't worry. Tara, can we unmute Jessica for her?
I can unmute, but Jessica, I'm asking you to unmute, so a box should be popping up on your screen.
There we go.
Oh, hi. Where is he? Bill? Who is it? It did the railroad one?
That was Bill, yeah.
Yeah. Bill, I wondered whether you used any local history archives for, besides schedules for like the people in the areas. This is close, I guess, Mr. Israel's question, because there's several libraries in, I was at a Plainfield Public Library, and also the Library of Congress has, we put together a big transportation of railroads and other kinds of transportation exhibit, and therefore collected a lot of things that aren't on the shore. But I'm sure there are other special collection, or maybe you have already looked at the local history collections, because in Plainfield, you'd never think of going to a special collection and saying, do you have any railroads? But anyway, just to note that we also found a major collection at the the Library of Congress, which has been put into the American collection, and it's all railroads, railroads in New Jersey, railroads in New York, railroads in North Jersey, railroads in South Jersey. So if you are continuing, check it out and just check out some of the special collections.
Yes, thank you. I will. On that question, I am working actually on a book with on the subject with the historian of Point Pleasant, who is in doing that collection. He is a big New York and Long Branch buff, and he has an entire half of the Point Pleasant collection is on that. I'm also working on an exhibit with the Seaside Park Historical Society on the Pennsylvania Railroad through town. And I've gotten in with the Asbury Park group, as well as some people in Long Branch. But thanks to COVID, it is very difficult right now.
Right, I can imagine. I've got some things at Library of Congress and put just a little 1-inch ad in Plainfield newspaper and said, does anybody have things on railroads? And if so, in the area, if so, come in on Saturday morning and let's just share some of your knowledge. I got a train spotter who came in, a guy who, I don't know, he was a mechanic on a Plainfield Railroad that went from Plainfield into the city next to the boats. And then, so I was expecting no one to come, and 7 people came in just for their little act. So it cost like $2,
Mm-hmm.
you know, just to say you're going to meet under such and such tree or something with COVID, who knows, but it's worth just trying it, because all of a sudden I had all these people who had collections of railroad windows and, you know, everything you can buy, the insides of railroads. Their grandmother, you know, had a special bed in a railroad car. You can't even imagine. So we all of a sudden had a railroad collection in Plainfield. That you don't need to know. I'm just saying, try advertising. It happened. I got some money for a transportation exhibit, and railroads really ended up to be on railroads. So
great.
It's a great project. Looks good.
Thank you.
Awesome. Well, Tara, you're running the overall meeting and it's just a touch past 5:30. So do we need to wrap things up?
I'm happy to wrap things up. If I can say thank you, Kamika. Thank you, Ashley. Thank you, Eric. And thank you, Bill. Those were great presentations. You also get the free 1-year membership to the NJSAA. Come on back to our meetings again. Here's a round of applause for them. Thank you, Melissa, for organizing this and doing a great job moderating. And our next event is March 10th. There's no business meeting. It's just a presentation by Allison Eisenberg on Trenton and on uprisings. And then we'll have our last business meeting of our academic year in April. But we'll see you in a month for Allison Eisenberg, and we look forward to seeing you all again. Thanks.